thank you for having me here this morning. I always have to start by saying these are my views, not the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City or the Federal Reserve System. Um, what I really hope to highlight with you today is just thinking about converting these natural resources to cash, because that's really what this boils down to. And really the energy production has really represented potentially new opportunities for economic development, especially in rural areas. And most of the attentions have been thinking about can really capture this and use it in such a way that it generates wealth, or it increases the wealth in rural areas, as opposed to it just being an export of this natural resource. And so certainly exploiting these oil and gas endowments or harnessing wind really is converting those natural resources either to payments to labor in terms of extracting it, or it's converting it to payments to governments either through tax revenue or royalties in terms of their ownership of mineral rights. And what I'm really going to focus on today is really more on specifically on land and mineral right owners. And I'm really going to focus on private land and mineral right ownership. And that why I'm looking at private versus public will be clear in just a little bit. But this energy activity is substantial in terms of natural gas. The 6 major plays in the United States produced over $211 billion in oil and gas in 2014. And just to put that in perspective, that's a little over 1% of U.S. GDP. So that's just the 6 major shale plays. That's not all of them. And from that production, it's estimated that it was around $40 billion, or just under $40 billion of royalty payments that were paid to private mineral right owners. And so that, again, is a very substantial number, yes.
Was that the 6 major oil players, or are you talking just the shale plays?
The shale plays, yeah.
Okay, wow.
Yeah. And so energy development, as we've heard, is really subject to these boom and bust cycles. Particularly on the oil and gas side, it's really been susceptible to commodity price cycles. Obviously, most people probably know that oil's trading around $44-45 dollars per barrel today. A little over a year and a half ago, we were up to still about $100 a barrel. And so, development has really kind of slowed as a result of that. On the renewable side, energy policy has really been the primary factor where people have focused on, and one of the things I've looked at in the past is related to the manufacturing base in the United States that produces wind turbines or wind turbine parts. And they've gone through numerous cycles of ramping up production and then having to cut back as the production tax credit would either expire or be set to expire and then renew again. But really this capture of economic value of energy development is key for the local economies, because if they're not able to capture it, then, as I mentioned earlier, it's just all the economic value is just basically leaving the area, and if they're not necessarily any better off, they might be worse off otherwise. And as it's been mentioned by the other speakers, we're really thinking about how the distribution of costs versus benefits varies across these areas. It really varies across not just across, but also within regions. And Rick mentioned the social gap, and I really think about this in the context of what's called participating versus non-participating, say, land and mineral right owners. So imagine that you are a landowner, and the person adjacent to you has 3 or 4 wind turbines that get placed on their property, but however your particular land is not selected. And so now, all of a sudden, within a community, you've got people that are directly benefiting from this development, and maybe those that aren't, but they still have to look at the wind turbines, or they still have to deal with the truck traffic, or whatever it might be. The issue in general is that there's this ongoing debate on the local economic implications and whether or not this energy development is beneficial in the long run. And we know that the boom can certainly yield large returns to land and mineral owners, but we really don't know for how long because as we've already heard, we know that there are cycles of development and that activity can fall off very quickly once the production stops. And really the income and wealth effects then depend upon the intensity and the duration of development, as well as the local ownership, how much of the land is actually owned locally where the activity is occurring, and in the case of oil and gas, how much of the mineral rights are actually owned locally where the production is occurring. And then of course there's always the possibility of these potential externalities related to pollution, related to groundwater contamination, related to congestion, related to pressure on local infrastructure, particularly on roads, and then also on local government as they try to respond to an influx of people kind of moving into the area. So in order for this activity to occur, deals have to be struck. And the reason why is because most of the development is located on private lands. So for the case of oil and gas, around 75% of onshore mineral rights are in private hands. And over 98% of wind development, according to WIA, has occurred on private land. And so while the public has ownership as well, particularly farther out west, if you look broader than that across most of the United States, it's these assets are held in local hands or in private hands. And so energy developers, they must enter into legal agreements with these land and mineral right owners. Contracts they typically establish what the owners will receive. And so obviously lease payments are the most common. These are fixed annual payments, usually on a per acre basis or maybe a per turbine basis. Bonus payments are typically used in the oil and gas sector, more so in wind, where it's a one-time payment. Is we want to secure your land, and so we're going to offer you some cash up front to try to secure that. And then royalty payments are the regular payments based upon the value of production. These are definitely more common in oil and gas compared to wind, and they're also much larger in terms of size, the actual dollars involved, compared to the fixed payments, but then also for the oil and gas side. And the payments are potentially then increasing wealth in the local area, depending on how people are saving versus spending the money, and then also potentially how they're affecting asset values. So think of land in particular. I'm going to kind of focus on that in a little bit more. So the typical wind lease really starts with what's called a wind option agreement, and these are very low dollar per acre payments, usually $2 to $10 per acre, and this option might only be for 3 to 5 years. So all it does is it secures the wind developer the option of perhaps doing development on the acreage. It acts like a bonus payment, as I mentioned earlier. And then in the development phase and beyond, these wind leases tend to be typically longer, 20 to 25 years, and the fixed annual lease payment is most common. But the amount really varies quite a bit across the United States, and it ranges anywhere from $2,000 to $10,000 per turbine per year. And sometimes it's less common. There can be a royalty payment of 3 to 5% on the value of the electricity produced. But you can imagine that the actual value of electricity produced is very, very small. And so in terms of wind, it's really this fixed annual lease payment is where most of the benefit to the landowner is going to be. And then in 2014, it's estimated that around $180 million was paid out to landowners from wind power development in the form of lease payments and royalty payments. Oil and gas, on the other hand, the contracts are signed before development begins. It gives the company, again, the right but not the obligation to develop. Average bonus payments, as we've looked into the data, are typically around $200 per acre. Recall that they're much smaller than that for wind. The term of the contract is usually 3 to 5 years, and what's interesting about oil and gas leases, they remain in effect as long as production continues. So whatever royalty rate you negotiated, even 5, 10, 15 years down the road, if production's continuing, that royalty rate is what's going to prevail. And in general, across the United States, on average, we're seeing royalty rates around of 18%, but they're much lower in some states, like in Pennsylvania, around 13.5%, versus in Louisiana, where they're higher at around 21.5%. One of the studies that was started when I was still at ERS and have continued on after going to the Fed was to look at farm households and to really use the Agricultural Resource Management Survey conducted by the USDA to look at farm households and how much energy payments in general they received. And so these data are from the survey that was conducted for the crop year 2011. And what we found is that $2.3 billion were paid out to farm households, either in the form of oil, gas, and wind combined. And what's interesting about that, that's roughly half of the largest federal farm support program at that time, which of course was the direct payments. And in 2011, only about 3.4% of farms received these payments, and that was on around 74,000 farms in general. And so obviously this isn't very broad-based. It's a small number of farms in relative terms that are receiving those. And in general, we found that these payments were most common in the plain states, and not surprisingly, about half of the farms specialize in raising beef cattle. And so you can imagine that whatever activity is occurring, that it might be less disruptive to grazing in general, so that kind of makes sense. Some farm households, however, did receive large energy payments, and we know that by just looking at the distribution. So on average, the average payment was a little over $30,000, but the median payment was $7,000. So that means 50% of farms received a payment of less than $7,000, and 50% received a payment more than $7,000. So the fact that the average is so much larger, we know that there's some farm households that are receiving very, very large payments, maybe while others aren't receiving as much. In terms of what these payments look like across major regions in the United States, I'm just going to kind of focus on the plains and the west. You can see that the median payment in the plain states was a little under $8,000 and about $13,000 in the west. What's interesting, though, is you kind of come across, on average, you had more farms receiving payments in the plains. 8% of farmers did, so that's obviously more than 3% for the entire United States, but still it's a fewer number of people actually receiving payments in these areas. But notice in the plains received around just under 62% of total payments that were paid out to farmers across this entire time frame. So that tells you that this activity is kind of very concentrated in relative terms to total government farm payments in 2011. You can see that the plains received about 30% of total farm payments given out throughout the United States. And so we often think about farm payments being concentrated, or as being the largest farms that are receiving most of the farm payments. Energy payments are very similar in that if you hold more land or if you hold more mineral rights, it kind of makes sense that you have a greater chance of getting more payments in that. Wealth effects. We wanted to see what this really meant for farm households in general, and what we found is that total farm household wealth increased by an estimated $7.7 billion in 2011, and 1.7 of that was from the savings of the payments versus $6 billion in terms of higher land values. And specifically, we wanted to determine how these energy payments were affecting farmland values. And what we found is that for every dollar of energy payments increased land values by $2.60. Now, that sounds like a lot, but when you think about it in the context of farm program payments, the literature that's looked at this has found that farm payments have increased land values anywhere from $5, usually around $5 per acre. And so the fact that the energy payments are contributing less to farmland appreciation really might be because of lower quality of land being used more frequently. And particularly where on the farm program payments, we know it's going to be in the more fertile cropland where that's going to pop up more. I'm going to talk now more specifically about oil and gas plays, and I have a list here of selected shale plays This particular map was reproduced from the Energy Information Administration, and they produce what's called drilling productivity reports on a monthly basis for a select number of oil and gas plays across the United States. So obviously Marcellus is predominantly a gas play, where the Bakken's oil. Niobrara is a combination of gas and oil. It's predominantly has been gas, but now oil has been picking up some. And then down in Texas, you got the Permian Basin, which is the oldest play, and then you have the Eagle Ford Shale, and then the Haynesville Shale, which is more natural gas, whereas in the other two in Texas, it's literally been more on the oil side. So, while some of these plays obviously do spread across multiple parts of the United States, the numbers I'm gonna show to you today really reflect activity taking place in these areas. So the value of production in 2014, we used those productivity reports to look and see what was really being produced, and then what the prevailing prices were. And not surprising, it's the oil plays that really stick out, right? Around $60 billion in production in 2014 for the Permian as well as the Eagle Ford. But look at the natural gas plays. The Haynesville around 11 billion versus the Marcellus maybe a little over 31 billion. So not too surprising that the oil, there's more economic value in the oil versus the natural gas. Now on the royalty rate side, what we see is on average, with the exception perhaps of the Haynesville, which is more of a natural gas play, you see that the oil plays have higher royalty rates, that the mineral right owners have been able to negotiate higher royalty rates of around 20% or higher. The lowest we see on average has been in the Marcellus area, between 13 and 14%. And so not only does the value of production really vary across these parts of the United States, the royalty rate that the mineral right owners are able to get really varies as well. Related to that, local ownership is another important piece here, and you really see Marcellus, you see ownership, local ownership of about 55%. Now, what we're focusing on local ownership here is we're specifically defining it as the county where production is occurring is the same county in which the mineral right owner lives. And so that's kind of a very conservative, or maybe kind of a strict definition of local, but it really kind of does give you the sense of people that might be dealing with the cost side of this development occurring, and how that looks. Not too surprising as you go out perhaps in the Bakken or further west in general, where you see local ownership of around 15%. Much smaller you get into the more or less populated areas of the United States. So then the local value of production, we just simply take what the value that was produced and the local ownership, and you can see that really then it's in the Eagle Ford where you see local value production really pop up. Principally here, that's because of it being oil, but also because maybe relative to some of the other oil plays, Eagle Ford has slightly higher local ownership. If we kind of think about this on a per person basis though, or look at how these dollars are spread across people, the local royalty income for 2014 really comes out, it ranges a lot, anywhere from $200 to $300 per person in some of these plays, all the way up to a little over $4,000 per person in the Bakken. And it's not too surprising, again, that the less populated areas, obviously those dollars are spread out across fewer people. To kind of put that in perspective, though, you see that government transfers, so this would be Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security payments, in general, are still larger, but in the case of the Bakken, you can see that these royalty payments are kind of on par with total government transfers into that area. Whereas in the more populated areas, like say in the Marcellus, where you have Pennsylvania and part of New York and some of Ohio, that the local royalty income is a much smaller deal relative say to government transfer payments. Yes.
Can you just briefly mention what the determinants are when it comes to how you, determine royalty income? because it doesn't seem to, match with the production value for a while. So that must have been just one of the determinants, or is it completely a different set of things we're talking?
No, we know what the prevailing lease contracts are in these areas. So we know the terms of the lease. So we know the royalty rates from the lease, and then we're able to match up the value of production and the royalty rate to get at what the royalty payments would be.
Sorry, just to perhaps clarify, I was just wondering if there were determinants that, these negotiating parties will look at in coming up, with the proposed versus the finals.
Yeah, some of the research we've been involved in is really trying to sort some of that out. But in general, what we can tell you is that the areas that are more productive, where the value's higher or the expected ultimate recovery is higher, it's where we tend to see higher royalty rates negotiated. Now, on average, though, it's not like a very substantial change, principally because these companies are able to really, they hold most of the cards, right? They're really able to exert, market power over the mineral right owners. But in general, we do see more areas with higher value production or more expected recovery to have higher royalty rates. That's another question.
Yeah, I was just curious, are people in Texas just better at negotiating this than people in Pennsylvania, or is it from the company standpoint, hey, it costs us less to drill in Texas, there's more wealth to share, here's an extra 2 points, let's just sign the paper?
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, you're thinking about how, think about Marcellus as primarily natural gas, and so you're dealing with a product that's,
Harder to ship out.
Yeah, it's the economic value of it is less. At the same time, though, you really don't know how much local information is really affecting, because in some parts of Texas, it's true though in Pennsylvania, where development's been going on for a very long time. So people have seen various cycles of boom and bust, and they maybe know better how to negotiate in some places where development has been around for much longer.
Just quickly, I just happen to notice Hyattsville, when it comes to that particular play, the production value wasn't necessarily higher than the others, but the royalty income was relatively higher on a per capita basis, I think.
Yeah.
I don't think that people therefore saw induced seismicity, I mean the frequency in terms of Oklahoma necessarily, which I think is what Hyattsville is contributing to in terms of its revenues and so on. But I'm just wondering, the fact that we're seeing more induced seismicity in some of the areas would give more leverage to the communities and the landowners and the local governments in negotiating.
Yeah, that's a possibility. Unfortunately, I don't have anything to say specifically to that. So I'm out of time. I'll just summarize with this: is that how much of this wealth really depends upon the intensity and duration of development. We've heard that a couple times today, so I hope you'll walk away with that in your mind. And the royalty lease payments vary substantially, but as I've showed you, they really vary a lot across regions, even within regions, and over time. Right now, with oil being over 50% lower than it was a year ago, even if production stays the same, your royalty payments you're getting now are half of what you got in the prior year. So that's an important point. And this really does suggest that land and mineral right owners likely view, or potentially should view, payments as temporary versus permanent. And we know in general that this has implications for how they might spend the money, right? If people think that they have a very temporary source of income, they're less likely to spend it and maybe save it. But if it's something that's occurring repeatedly, then they might be willing to consume that more, or potentially even use it for investment. So with that, I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.